Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to today's ICIT virtual briefing, Securing the Drone Supply Chain, a Manufacturer's Guide to Critical Component Compliance. I'm Brett Friedman, Senior Director of Emerging Technology at the Institute of Critical Infrastructure Technology, or ICIT. Our mission is to modernize, secure, and make resilient critical infrastructure that provides for people's foundational needs. By applying a people-centric lens to critical infrastructure research and decision-making, our work ensures that modernization and security investments have a lasting positive impact on society. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an often discussed but not well understood area referred to as the covered list. Administered by the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, the covered list was originally established under the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act of 2019, or STCNA, to prevent federal subsidies, at the time namely the Universal Service Fund, from being used to purchase network equipment from specific entities deemed national security risks. So primarily think Huawei, ZTE. In 2021, passage of the Secure Equipment Act drastically expanded this utility by requiring the FCC to deny any new equipment authorizations for listed devices. Because nearly all radio frequency emitting devices must be authorized by the FCC to be either legally imported, marketed, or sold in the US, this legislation effectively transformed the covered list into a nationwide market entry ban. What began as a narrow tool to manage telecom subsidies has evolved over time into a comprehensive instrument driving American industrial policy and cybersecurity. Recent developments have expanded use of the covered list from firm-specific targeting to broad place of production bans and pivoted to industry-based or category-wide restrictions. Rather than naming single corporations, the FCC is now banning entire categories of technology based simply upon the location where they're produced. This has led to the addition of all foreign-produced uncrewed aircraft systems, drones, back in December of 2025, and more recently, just this last month, at the end of March on the 23rd, all foreign-produced consumer-grade routers were added to the covered list. These authorities, frameworks, and precedents are becoming the blueprint for how Washington will assess ownership, control, and supply chain integrity across the full spectrum of infrastructure. And that's what we're here to discuss today. But before we dive any further, and now our illustrative panelists will get into the history here in a bit more detail. I'm joined by three accomplished professionals in this space with extensive experience in the executive and legislative branches of government. We're excited to bring together both current and former officials from the Department of Justice, the FCC, and Customs and Border Protection within the Department of Homeland Security to discuss these issues. First off, Rebecca Clinton is an attorney in the Operations and Emergency Management Division of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the FCC. She is focused on providing legal guidance and analysis related to reducing national security threats to telecommunications, including assisting in maintaining the FCC's covered list. She joined the commission back in 2023, following several years serving as a prosecutor. Peter Yun founded Rainfall Strategies as a public sector navigation consultancy aimed at helping organizations reach every level of government for legal and policy solutions. Peter's unique background includes service in all three branches of the federal government, as well as in the New York State government. Most recently, Peter served as the acting chair of the FCC's Enforcement Bureau and its 13 field offices, the largest organizational unit within that commission. Peter joined the FCC after serving in several leadership roles in the Department of Justice, including acting AG in the Office of Legislative Affairs, where he worked to develop and implement strategies to advance DOJ's highest priority legislative initiatives, manage oversight obligations, and navigate executive nominations in matters before Congress. And finally, last but not least, is Matthew Klein, a senior executive in security with more than 3 decades of experience leading complex investigative, counterintelligence, and enterprise security programs across both government and the private sector. Most recently, he served as the Assistant Commissioner and Chief Security Officer for CBP, where he oversaw enterprise-wide security, insider threat, and integrity programs supporting a 67,000 person global workforce. His experience spans law enforcement in the federal side, critical infrastructure security, and corporate investigations, including leadership roles at Kroll and the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, where he rose to the rank of deputy chief. His work is focused on safeguarding organizational integrity, mitigating supply chain and insider risks, and supporting mission resilience in complex operational environments. So with that, thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start off by trying to frame the core issue here, which is basically expanding the covered list across global supply chains and critical infrastructure. So let me direct that first question to Peter, given your breadth of experience and most recently in FCC. How did we get here?
Thank you so much, Brett. Thank you to ICIT. Thank you to my co-panelists here in your distinguished service. Really looking forward to being here, and thank you for being here. If we could just maybe flash the first slide up there. This provides just kind of a big overview, and Brett had laid out some of the legislative history, and myself having served in Congress between 2015 and 2018 in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and being a legislative junkie, I just wanted to provide some context both as to what is going on both in the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. I'll touch a little bit on the courts just to give some framing so that those in the audience could really see the long history, but also really the short history with respect to the covered list, how it came to be, its statutory authorizations, and elsewhere. I will say, and separate and apart even from this timeline here, this is dating back. So I first went to law school right before 9/11 in 2001. Dating back then, after 9/11, the Patriot Act had been enacted, and national security, sort of as a practice area, fast became something that that both the country was very, very much concerned about, with both implementing legislation, surveillance authorities, things like that. And really, even up till about 2007 or so, just to set kind of the stage here, the top concern that had been identified by the U.S. intelligence community at that time was terrorism. It was focused on the Middle East primarily, and Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. Cyber was not even mentioned. And in fact, if you look at the FCC's own history, that very year in 2007, China Telecom, which was a People's Republic of China affiliated and state-owned telecom platform, had basically been granted FCC licenses to provide what's known as 214 licenses, both international and domestic services. Not a blip. Fast forward then, really within a really quick turnaround up to about, and I'll flash forward to about 2012, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, or HPSCI, for those of you who are legislative watchers, they, after doing a lot of investigative work, had publicly labeled for the first time Huawei and ZTE, which were, again, PRC state-owned telecom companies, as threats to U.S. national security. Now, this was important because not only was that fact-finding and then the actual the report that was issued, but it then began to really spur on additional conversations about the kind of authorities that should be or needed to be conferred to the executive branch to address the emerging issue, particularly when it came to, for example, foreign ownership, surveillance powers, also with respect to critical infrastructure. Again, flash forward from there, in 2016, you had the OPM hack, the Office of Personnel Management, that really had then compromised much of the personal information for the federal workforce. And then in 2017 to 2018, where now we get on to this timeline here, we began to see the USG, the US government, pivoting to focus on threats to critical infrastructure and those arising from foreign investment in the United States. It's not mentioned here, but I was in Congress at the time. Brett, you were there also in the Senate, but Congress had passed a Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which then updated, for example, the CFIUS process. And then in August of 2018, you'll see here the National Defense Authorization Act, that's the NDAA, Section 889, which had been enacted as this was part of John McCain's legacy, a statutory provision that had prohibited federal agencies from procuring or using telecom equipment from Huawei, ZTE, and several other Chinese firms. Now, this then sets the stage and previews what would come nearly a year and a half later with what was the enactment of the Secure Networks Act, as it said here, or the Secure Trusted Communications Networks Act, which is shorthand for either STUCNA or the Secured Networks Act here, which was, it was called the Act of 2019, but it was really enacted in 2020. And I think that also goes to show just how young this program is, because at that point, you started to see threat assessment label cyber as the #1 concern for the US intelligence community. China gets called out more and more as a threat to critical infrastructure. And under the Secure Networks Act, that act prevented equipment that poses national security risk from entering US communications networks, and assisting carriers in removing this, again, this equipment that posed that risk. The FCC then established, for the first time ever, a reimbursement program, the RIP and Replace program, to assist certain providers to both rip out and replace Huawei and ZTE equipment from its networks. And then, and you saw just separately, the FCC started to provide more scrutiny with respect to its other authorities with respect to common carriage in the United States and providing international telecom equipment. Now, let me just sort of like speed through kind of what happens thereafter. Of course, the FCC publishes for the first time the covered list under the Secure Networks Act, publishing a list of communications equipment and services that are deemed to pose an unacceptable risk to national security. The list initially included 5 state-owned entities that prohibit, again, the use of federal subsidies to obtain certain equipment and services. And after that, you started to see another update in 2021. After that publication, Congress then updates it with the Secure Equipment Act that required the FCC to establish rules saying that it would no longer review or approve authorizations for equipment on the covered list. And again, separately, the FCC was moving to revoke certain authorizations for 214 licenses and others. Here, then in between the period of and again, you're probably tracking here the change of administrations between 2022 and 2024, you have iterative additions there. Again, China Unicom, Pacific Networks, providing, again, telecommunication services, and then Kaspersky Labs gets added as well. Flash forward again, during that period in 2023 on the legislative side, you start to see the establishment of the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the US and the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP committee. And then flash forward again to in late 2024, Congress then tucked in another provision in the FY25 NDAA, which was Section 1709, those of you that are familiar with this, that essentially provided a legislative authority to then address what is the DJI and Autel robotics issue. And that is to add those entities to the covered list and to provide a triggering date, which again, right before that triggering date came to pass on December 23rd. In December 22nd in 2025, the FCC takes this big action and this big swing, and I think we'll hear from my former colleague Rebecca a little bit later about that, about the foreign produced drone ban and the critical components ban, which then gets, there's more iterations of information that comes out of the commission in a couple months after that. And then of course, just a few weeks ago with the foreign produced consumer grade routers ban. So that is kind of the history here, but it's also just to show some of the framing, but also to project out, I think, where we're going with this. And you hear a little bit more from Rebecca. And if we could go to the next slide, I'll just flash this up here because this is just a visual. This is just a visual look at how the covered list is actually structured under Section 2 of the Secure Networks Act. And I know Rebecca will speak about that more, but yeah, so let me pass it back to you, Brett, and thank you for allowing me to go over that history.
Thanks, Peter. Very comprehensive, and as you note, fairly recent as well, which is quite interesting. So before we go over to Rebecca, I just had one question that I wanted to give over to Matt, because you've been in this space for many years and seen it evolve over the last 3 decades in different positions. We're no longer talking just about Huawei and ZTE, as Peter mentioned. Curious to get a little bit as to what your experience has been and how do you view the import of the FCC's covered list determinations of recent that Peter mentioned.
Thanks for having me, Brett. Really, really good to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from my co-panelists who have just some remarkable experience there in this particular area. But from my experience at DHS, So you're right. We're not talking about individual companies anymore. We're talking about entire ecosystems. So what I saw from my 10 years at DHS and at CDP is that adversaries adapted much faster than policy. So as pressure increased and we just talked about Huawei and ZTE, the risk didn't disappear. It just rearranged across the supply chain. So what concerns me now, again, as a fairly recent DHS executive, is not just ownership, but it's control, it's access, it's dependency. So you can have a device, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, that looks compliant on paper, but it relies on foreign firmware, cloud services, or other components that can create real exposure. So that's something that we should all be concerned about. So from an operational standpoint, just to get to your question at CBP, we often had to think beyond is this vendor trusted, and really ask ourselves, where is this built, and who maintains it, who can update it, and what happens if that access is leveraged. And that's going to be very, very relevant to the covered list and when we talk about drones. So I'd say the recent covered list actions, especially that we're seeing now moving towards category or country of origin restrictions, it just reflects that reality. So it's less about punishing specific actors, and it's more about conducting and reducing really risk across all critical infrastructure. So I'll just say that the challenge is that policy now is moving a lot faster than industry is prepared to respond, and that's going to take some time to catch up.
Thank you, man. That's actually, it's unique, I would say, because policy oftentimes is not something that is quick and responsive, essentially. And so I'm curious, Rebecca, given your current role and your prior as well, working as a prosecutor, you're now directly involved in devising these policies within the FCC. To the extent you're able, given your current role as well, can you take us through the process of how these evolve? And Hugo, if you wouldn't mind putting up that second slide again, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brett, and thank you to the co-panelists and everyone who's participating here today. It's great to be here. Talking about I'd love to talk about this. I mean, Peter's history of Stigna and the covered list and sort of where we are today, and just the point, I guess, to reiterate that comes to mind with this when you all are talking about sort of how young the list is, or how we've really seen a lot of developments within the most past year, especially with these newer types of determinations, is that the Secure Networks Act really has enabled, I think, the FCC and largely like the US government through the interagency to move more quickly. One of, as you can see from this slide, which wonderfully lays out sort of, as it's titled, the architecture of the covered list, the FCC itself, we are not under the Secure Networks Act, we are not charged with making those determinations. And so the way that it's set up is, as you can see here on the left, the inputs are their determinations under the statute from relevant sources of determinations from either an executive branch interagency body that has appropriate national security expertise, the Department of Commerce pursuant to an executive order having to do with ICT supply chain, Congress as laid out with those Chinese entities from the John McCain Act, and then of course, we had specific here, the drones, the 1709 section in the NDAA, and then appropriate national security agencies who have that expertise. And so the way, from staff point of view, to kind of walk you through sort of how it works and what you're seeing on the back end is that, the FCC is really the minister of the list. We are charged with the statute, with maintaining it. Once we received a determination and we find that it's a specific determination that meets the criteria under Stigna, that certain equipment and or services pose, an unacceptable threat to national security or U.S. persons, then the FCC is charged with updating the list. We do this via public notice, as you all have seen. And so we're able to move quickly in that way and enable, I guess, really the national security agencies and Congress to implement and take action against this equipment and services that they find to be troublesome. So in that way, I think that's why we have seen sort of this myriad, growth and change and sort of, it's a lot to keep up with, I guess, in terms of adjusting. But it's nice in that government isn't really moving slow when it comes to this area, I would say, relatively speaking. So once we receive a determination, like I said, we put together a public notice and we released that. Harkening back to the history, I mean, really, where the covered list as a tool, gets its teeth is, of course, from the equipment authorization consequences, right? And the prohibition on new models receiving new authorization is really where we see a lot more, I guess, power from the list itself. I would just reiterate too that one of the things that Peter talked about in the history, it's sourcing. I mean, it's not like with Secure Networks Act just came along and then the FCC sort of had an interest in national security that it never had before. One of the original purposes for which the commission was created was for the purpose of national defense. And I think you've really seen, especially under this administration, a focus on the national security. Since I've been with the commission, which was starting in 2023, I've worked with covered list material and has just, it's been interesting to come along for the ride and be part of sort of the growth in the list and see it evolve just even in this short amount of time under the laws that, charge us with maintaining it. So depending on, the determination, I mean, you've seen with drones and now routers, we are trying to provide as much guidance and answer as much questions. We are fielding a lot of questions from industry, understandably so, and encourage, those questions. And we're working, meaning I'm specifically in PSHSB, the Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau, which is a mouthful, but our bureau is specifically charged with maintaining that list. But we work with the Office of Engineering and Technology and other bureaus and offices across the commission to make sure that we can provide the guidance when we can for these important questions that are coming up as businesses and clients. I'm sure there's probably a lot of attorneys on this webinar are trying to navigate these new additions. So just to reiterate again, that the FCC is not the body making the determination. We receive the determination. We're charged with monitoring, those sources of determinations, and then pursuant to our statutory responsibility, it triggers that addition to the covered list. Another aspect of this is that, as we've seen, especially within the past couple of years, is that as, this interesting tool, the covered list for the US government, has grown and has its teeth, the equipment authorization aspect. You've seen the commission itself leverage that as a tool across commission-wide actions. PSHSB, where I work, we work with other bureaus and offices on that national security aspect. Undersea cable review of rules as an example. Again, we work very closely with the Office of Engineering and Technology, as you've seen, like the Bad Labs item from last year and other proceedings to strengthen and secure, the equipment authorization program. So this is, it's been interesting to see its evolution. With these most two recent additions have been production based, and it'll be interesting to see, where this continues to go as we go forward.
Thank you, Rebecca. And on that note, if I may, I think there is, there's the two sides of the coin, right? So there, from an industry vantage point, some may argue that, banishing foreign produced drones and routers without any really robust alternative threatens to halt the market entirely, given that domestic manufacturing, although it is ramping up, although DOW is putting a significant degree of emphasis on that, it's still not where it needs to be. And then on the other piece, in the March announcement, the domestically sourced routers really aren't in existence in terms of manufacturing domestically. So I guess, can you provide a little bit of insight as to how the notices mitigate that disruption and how it's enforcing this across the consumer market writ large. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as I mentioned previously, I mean, again, you know, these additions are prospective, right? The ban, so to speak, if that's just sort of like the easy way to call it, is prohibiting import, sale, or use of, you know, these additions do not prohibit the import, sale, or use of any existing device that's already been received previous authorization, that are in the hands of consumers now. You know, it's sort of a going forward basis in terms of new models receiving new authorizations. And Brett, as you mentioned, I mean, especially with the drone edition, you can see that there was a lot of activity, you know, that developed, you know, over the course of the PNs or public notices related to that edition, accounting for, and really those were additional updates to the covered list, based on those determinations from the Department of War about, hey, here are some really 3 groups of trusted drone technology and critical components that are related that we find do not pose national security threats. So I think that from where I stand, you know, just as a staff member, not, you know, it seems that there's recognition that how to deal with this going forward. And so when we receive those determinations that those particular technologies don't pose threats, you know, those are going to be updated. And so you see the establishment of the conditional approval process, which really the conditional approvals are, again, national security determinations. Now, those are for set periods of time. I mean, the first 2, I guess, sort of groups, you know, the blue list and the domestic end product group, you know, those are until January 1, 2027. But the conditional approval guidance, I believe, indicates, and you can find all of this on the FCC website, on the covered list website. We've got a lot of the documents laid out there. Provides for, you know, indicates that Department of War has indicated they will do reassessments. This is not to say that I have some particular insider knowledge about whether, you know, that means that those periods will be extended, but you know, that information is out there about sort of what could happen with regards to those 2 exemptions, so to speak. And then, of course, the conditional approval process itself. I mean, we've seen within the past few weeks, you know, we published our public notice for the first batch of conditional approvals for those particular make and models with respect to drones. And the routers determination also provides similar, the same process, essentially, that those exceptions can be granted for periods of up to 12 months with, I believe, reassessments. So I think another colleague from the FCC earlier in the week when they were talking about some of this sort of, I thought was a good statement about, you know, it's not just about keeping out bad technology or vulnerable technology and equipment and services. You know, obviously national security, I mean, it's as grave as it gets or as serious as it gets, but also promoting and, you know, the deployment of domestic growth and technology. I mean, I think it's in the America First investment policy that economic security is national security. And so this all kind of goes hand in hand with these critical technologies that have access and can affect and interfere with critical infrastructure and really in some ways are critical infrastructure in themselves. As we know, law enforcement uses them, et cetera. So, you know, also not to get too much into the weeds, but I mean, small points, but, you know, with these additions, you know, you see waiver of class 1 permissive changes that OET has issued for periods of time, you know, so that these technologies can receive software and firmware updates, understanding those aspects. So I think you know, we encourage questions. We are, again, coordinating internally to make sure that we are getting answers to people in hand. So, you know, we know a lot of people, I'm sure some people on this call have reached out. So we are answering those questions. We're getting to those questions, and we encourage those questions, and we will try to get you an answer to those questions if we can.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I know that it's kind of, you know, you toe the line as it relates to the internal deliberations and also what is publicly available, and just appreciate your forthrightness. The next question is really open to everyone, so feel free to jump in here, but it relates to the term of our adversarial influence, which is often mentioned in the policy statements. I'm just curious, can any of you shed a bit more light for those joining from the private sector as to ownership versus control versus dependency. Where is that line being drawn, or where do you see that line being drawn? How best to avoid kind of what I believe is a concern amongst many of indirect exposure. In other words, companies internally have software components, managed services, which may be, afterthoughts, but are in fact brought in the ambit of the discussion, given the breadth of the policy announcements. And finally, kind of how far do we think the government is willing to go? And maybe this is for Peter and Matthew rather than Rebecca, necessarily relating to, de-risking versus decoupling. So any of those aspects, I know there's a mouthful, but would appreciate kind of a perspective of either where you think speculating where it might go, knowing we're not truth tellers in terms of having a crystal ball in front of us, but how best to kind of answer and tackle those and give some guidance.
Yeah, I'm happy to just kind of just provide some reflections just as a starting point. I think what's interesting here, because when you talk about line drawing, I think it is what has been very interesting, especially because right now there are proceedings that are ongoing. So in addition to, for example, as Rebecca had mentioned, not only did these public notices and the subsequent public notices and fact sheets that have basically helped to provide regulatory clarity, there's still a lot of uncertainty for which I actually think that we will have to really track what the courts do, and also how the legislative branch, if at all, responds to some of this. I think from even that first slide that I showed, this was, for example, the December 2025 action was a categorical approach, which I think had taken a lot of folks in the private industry off guard, especially because Section 1709 of the previous year's NDAA had a very specific provision with a triggering language with respect to specific entities, which is how, for example, again, when we go over the history. So this was kind of a big swing. And the reason why I think then we're now tracking whether, for example, the FCC has now exceeded its statutory authority to do something like that and take that kind of swing, particularly with respect to the national security determination. And of course, the only real case on point that I'm aware of, for example, is the Hikvision case versus the FCC, which, as I understand it, was more scrutiny that was applied under the Administrative Procedures Act, and whether, for example, the agency in, for example, designating Hikvision on the covered list was that its actions were arbitrary or capricious. But really, if you actually look at how, for example, with the drone categorical ban had been enacted, and now you have DJI and Autel that have petitioned for reconsideration within the agency, and these are ongoing proceedings right now. And DJI's arguments are even beyond APA type challenges. They're saying that, hey, there were due process violations here as well that violated its Fifth Amendment due process rights, that listing this authorization deprived them of protected liberty interests. So it'll be interesting to see how the courts actually say where the line is drawn with respect to the both statutory limits, but also constitutional limits of how the agency acted here. There's a lot of sort of like factual questions also where folks are like, well, hey, we never had a chance to, provide notice and comment even before, for example, these lines were made. So I think it's going to be really an interesting survey as you look forward, even with respect to the router ban, about these legal limits, and to see how, for example, the courts, especially after a wave of just regulatory decisions, whether it has to do with even enforcement under SEC versus JARCASI, even after Loper Bright, all of these questions that will probably provide a little bit more guidance, but I will say separate and apart even from the legal cases. As Rebecca had alluded to, there's another proceeding that was just announced a week ago called Unleashing American Drone Dominance. I think it was implementing 2 different EOs that the president, and it was to basically help facilitate domestic manufacturing with respect to drones. And in those proceedings, what again is of interest is that the FCC is seeking feedback with respect to providing greater regulatory clarity. And I think that is sort of the effort here. And so much of this is still in a very much, and I think the FCC has admitted this as far as just saying like, there's a gray zone. And so we'd like the feedback to get this right, to both facilitate domestic manufacturing, but also to protect our critical infrastructure, our national security interests. So I think there are all these open questions. And so I really think that there is going to be sort of a lot of informational needs that the FCC has, both from industry, many of those here on this call, many of the experts who work in any of these types of issues, but also understanding the need for greater coordination across the federal apparatus. Rebecca mentioned, for example, she's in the Public Safety Bureau. There are 17 bureaus and offices, and they all report up to the chair. And each of the bureaus or offices, actually, some have more principally, different kinds of authorities that even the intra-agency coordination takes a lot of work, whether it's between the Office of Engineering Technology, the Enforcement Bureau that, again, enforces the OET's rules, the Public Safety Bureau, Rebecca had mentioned, also the Office of International Affairs. And so all of these different bureaus and offices, too, have to do the requisite coordination in addition to the interagency coordination. So I think a lot of that will remain to be seen. It's a lot of work to be done both within the federal government and the US government, but also among the ecosystem of stakeholders, which also, by the way, includes state and local government as well.
Thanks, Peter. Matt, before I turn it back to Rebecca, anything further you wanted to add?
As usual, I can't top Peter on that, but just that sort of interrelated is whether, what we're seeing now is moving towards becoming a template for risk management. And so personally, again, from the sort of operator's perspective, I think it's certainly becoming a template as what we're seeing and how we're mitigating this type of risk. But so again, and we talked about this earlier, that it's moving us from a reactive enforcement to a more proactive risk reduction posture, and that's going to be a big shift. But for folks listening on the call, and I talk to folks offline often that are interested about how things are going or where things are going. If this is going to work as a model, it has to be paired with a couple of things, and supply chain transparency for folks that are going to be importing and manufacturing, and many organizations right now just don't have that. And then identifying viable substitutes to components and critical components, and you have to have realistic sourcing options. So I think what we're seeing now is a blueprint. We're going to, and again, my FCC colleagues know it much better than I do, but it's just a good opportunity we're seeing a new direction in how we look at these issues.
Thanks, Matt, and helpful. And I think it takes us to the question of kind of the next step in this, right? As these matters, as Peter mentioned, are being litigated and adjudicated in the context of adversarial litigation. My question, and this is for Rebecca, is kind of, as we're talking about enforcement actions, and I'm sure, as things move forward, they may be contemplated and the policies for them developed. I'm curious a little bit as to the interagency coordination that occurs. Obviously, with Peter's first slide, there's a robust set of policies, procedures, executive orders, and statutes that dictate kind of from whence these come. And as you noted, the FCC is kind of a implementer, right? They're not making the determination as it relates to the front end. So I'm curious, both for the entirety of the process, really, from its recommendation to provide an enforcement action or to issue a proclamation as it relates to, say, drones. What is the degree of interagency coordination with your executive branch partners all across the board, DOW, DHS, Treasury, Justice, how can you provide a little bit more granularity as to how that is playing out in practice?
Sure. I mean, with additions to the cover list, I mean, and the drone one is interesting because of, the statutory mandate with particular entities. And then we see this broader or additional determination about foreign produced drones and drone components in general. So that's a very interesting addition because it's got that twofold part to it. We don't make the FCC people probably going to get sick of me hearing saying this and just it being, highlighted that we don't make the determination, but of course, we're with the conditional approval process. I mean, and again, we're not the ones approving any of the exemptions, but we are receiving them. So, I mean, you can see some coordination going there. And so that once we receive those approvals, again, we can update the cover list. I would say more generally speaking, my experience with the commission, even apart, like, kind of stepping away from the covered list specifically, just because our mandate and role in it is so clearly defined by statute and our implementing rules, that there is interagency coordination. I mean, one thing I think is a good microcosm example of how that's facilitated is the Council on National Security that Chairman Carr stood up last year. These conversations about these additions are coming, and the additions themselves are coming, sort of around this 1-year anniversary of that council being stood up. And what that is, a task force model in the sense of that the leaders of the different bureaus and offices that Peter discussed at the FCC are coming to the table because there are so many. National security is not just in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, right? It's telecommunications, communications, and technology that spans all of the different equities, I guess, of the different bureaus and offices, and to bring everyone together to discuss sort of what's going on. And then I think that lends itself towards better coordination with law enforcement partners, with the interagency, both domestically and internationally, to understand and move faster with the most information, I believe, on sort of what the FCC's authorities are and what the interagency's authorities are, to be able to more nimbly and more effectively, I guess, address these national security concerns and mitigate them. So I think that council, which again, the leaders of those bureaus and offices are a part of, really helps facilitate that. But that interagency coordination, I mean, occurs, I think, at the staff level, I would say, especially in the division that I'm in, the Operations and Emergency Management Division of the Bureau. And so, I'll just take this moment to say, I guess, in my particular division, the legal team is actually quite small, but it's a vast division that involves a lot of people that do operations, right? And they're working with a lot of different stakeholders that are dealing with these national security issues. And so it's been a good marrying up, I think, of, our team is a good, I think, again, example of being able to show that coordination to attack some of these problems that you see in the real world, that, for example, CBP or something like that is going to see. So, yeah, I think that's what I would say about that.
Okay, no, that's helpful. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think opening up again to other folks, kind of, I've worked on CFIUS throughout different points in my career, foreign investment review. There's been a lot of activity in recent memory, right? In the last 10 years. I mean, Peter already mentioned FIRMA, which updated CFIUS. You have the bulk data rule. You have outbound investment regimes. And now you see an expansion as it relates to the manner in which the implementation and usage of the covered list. How does any of you see that expansion intersecting with they're independent processes, but there's relationships there because they're all kind of dealing with supply chain related issues. They're all aspects that companies are going to need to pay attention to depending on the scope of their operations. So I'm trying to get an understanding. I mean, it's becoming increasingly complex. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but how should folks think of these in the context of potentially the intersection or how these would interplay with one another? Over to anyone to answer that.
So, Brett, thank you for mentioning sort of this broader ecosystem, which are, again, a combination of authorities that Congress has enacted. And I think what it really requires, at least amongst the stakeholder community, is not only a vision of the trees, in other words, like the actual widgets, et cetera, but again, understanding the forest, about how it's all interrelated. And by that, I mean, because of the risk profile that any company that has any kind of digital footprint or is using customer data, that certainly with respect to national security concerns and the ways in which the executive branch, and you're starting also to see, for example, state level enforcement with respect to data management, data protection, data privacy, that all have this kind of similar risk profile. I do think that there is a level of uniform, both auditing, understanding, and also proactive mitigation that are steps that and you could draw, for example, analogies from when I sat in the Enforcement Bureau, we would negotiate, for example, what were consent decrees for various violations of the Communications Act, and in particular with respect to customer proprietary network information. And basically, you would outline in that consent decree what the going forward basis would look like for both auditing purposes, data protection, data security. And it seems that you really can provide that similar framework, whether it's even, for example, you're negotiating mitigations under, a team telecom process or a CFIUS process, et cetera. And I think it does require a level of fluency and command that really legal officers, but also folks who understand sort of the tech stack can really figure out how to implement a uniform strategy for all of this. And then also keep an eye on the various ways in which the policymaking is occurring so frequently, and sometimes in ways that maybe might seem aggressive, but so that nobody's caught off guard to the extent you can be. And this is why, again, the uniformity approach, I think, will help to mitigate when, for example, Congress is looking at a certain issue and somebody tucks in a provision into the NDAA, or, conversely, whether, for example, a public notice is issued that, again, goes to, and again, the FCC has incredible amounts of authority, because every time there's any kind of radio frequency or spectrum, like I was talking to my kids about their AirPods, that has a little FCC stamp on it as well. Like you could imagine the type of factual scenarios for which, for example, if there was a national security determination, the ways in which the FCC, especially in this somewhat unclear legal environment as to the exact scope of its authorities, that again will be litigated, but you can definitely foresee certain other kinds of swings being taken here in ways that again will I think will provide more clarity in the future. But I think it really does demonstrate that stakeholders need to have a forest view as well as a trees view of the landscape here.
Thank you. And Rebecca, feel free to pipe in and give us a preview of those future policy-related announcements. Don't hesitate. Matt, anything further before my final question?
No, just to add to Peter's point, and I'm always smart enough to go after him, but I think what to your question is what we're seeing is a convergence of issues, and by that I mean that CFIUS typically looked at ownership and investment risk, and what we're seeing now with the covered list is more of an equipment risk sort of framework, and those lines are blurring. So we need to really merge those two, to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Matt. So before we close, and I think this has been a really provocative and interesting discussion, hopefully for the audience as well, is kind of, if we're serious about rooting out vulnerabilities in our technology, what is the single most important message that someone in the industry should take away from the discussion that we've been having? And you can feel free to take that in any direction and give a bit of a closing thought here before I wrap it up. Maybe we take it around the horn from where I sit. So Matt, you're going to come up first. Sorry, you're not going after Peter on this one.
No worries. And a slightly different perspective, again, putting on my CSO hat over at DHS. If I have a message, it's that compliance is not the same as security. And I think that organizations that are going to be best positions are really the ones that start treating supply chain risk as an operational issue and not just a regulatory requirement. So it's going to be important to look at it that way.
All right, over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks. I mean, just with the whole theme of this discussion and, you know, just at least based on the last two additions to the covered list, I mean, foreign adversary ownership and just how we have leveraged the covered list into the more broader, you know, foreign adversary definitions and other items. I mean, that's really, it's not necessarily, oh, a particular technology, but it's that nexus to that ownership. And even with the original additions to the covered list that are entity focused, those determinations, if you go to look at them, I believe all are talking about the foreign ownership aspect and connect. So it's really all been there since the beginning. It's just the determinations come in different ways. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least, as we had started with, Peter, over to you.
Yeah, and I'll just maybe just rehash. I think what it would require is a level of sort of fluency with respect to both the legislative policymaking regulatory landscape, and of course trying to understand exactly and hopefully really in working with the government so that stakeholders that understand the actual, for example, technical feasibility, the products that they are both manufacturing, trying to import, that there is a level of harmonization, I will say, as far as like the information flow, so that the government understands with respect to its authorities how it's working in order to both, I guess, adopt a framework of both unleashing something like drone dominance, but also protecting national security and finding the right balance between all of those different examples. And so I'm grateful for organizations like ICIT and the work in really with respect to critical infrastructure fluency as far as the issue spotting that needs to take place at the outset of any of these conversations. So I would say that would be sort of my summary of talking about the rooting out vulnerabilities in our technology.
Great. Well, I can't thank you enough, Rebecca, Matt, and Peter, for a thoughtful and timely discussion. I think today we only were able to really scratch the surface, even though it was nearly an hour in time. But the area is becoming increasingly complex. I think we can all agree on that. And often what has been a reactionary role that the US government serves is becoming in some way, shape, or form a more proactive vantage point or perspective. And there's been a dramatic uptick, as we've discussed, in issuances by the FCC, expanding the scope of the covered list, drones, routers, two recent examples in the last few months. I think this is an indicator of where this administration is going to continue to aggressively pursue. Rebecca, you don't have to comment. It reflects a broader government effort to address adversarial influence across critical infrastructure writ large. It doesn't focus just on ownership, but control, dependency, and hidden exposure across the global supply chain. So ultimately, this conversation is about what comes next. How do these frameworks, as I mentioned, intersect with investment screening and national security regimes? What manufacturers must do now to stay ahead of an increasingly aggressive and complex regulatory landscape? And I imagine we'll probably need to unpack this more as these policies are implemented and enforced. And I hope I'll be able to bring back this group for a subsequent conversation at some point when warranted. So on behalf of ICIT, thank you to all of you and to everybody who joined us to listen to this webinar. We look forward to seeing you at a future ICIT briefing, and have a great and enjoyable rest of your afternoon. Thanks, everybody.